So Chuck, could you just give us an overview of what the Simplicity Workshop is?
Sure. Simplicity is based on Edward de Bono's book by the same title, the book Simplicity. And what it does, the Simplicity Workshop takes the theories and the ideas that are contained in that book, and what it does is it explains how to use them in a very practical step-by-step fashion. The book and the workshop talk about three main ways that things can be simplified. Essentially, we can remove things, we can replace things, or we can restructure things. And by things, I'm referring to physical elements as well as parts of a procedure or a process, steps in a process or a procedure. And Simplicity Workshop provides these specific tools and techniques that enable us to do that, to remove, replace, or restructure. And to me, what's really interesting about the Simplicity Workshop is that many of the tools that are presented are driven by Edward de Bono's lateral thinking process, and it adds a very rich dimension to approaching the whole topic of simplicity.
So Chuck, if the workshop is based off of Dr. Edward de Bono's Simplicity book, why should people attend a workshop instead of simply reading the book?
You know, geez, that's a really good question, and I think Edward de Bono himself would respond, as he has in many of his own books. He says that knowing a theory is one thing, but actually using it or practicing it is quite another. And he uses the analogy of a tennis player. I can read lots of books on tennis, but it doesn't necessarily make me a good tennis player. I have to go out on the court and actually practice. And if I really want to be half decent at tennis, it helps to have a good coach. And so what we have with the Simplicity Workshop is a chance to practice the theories that are presented in the workshop and get feedback as to how we're using them.
So really the difference that you're pointing out is the practical practice and coaching that you can get within a workshop.
Absolutely, and I think that's the case with most of de Bono thinking systems training is one has a chance to take the very rich theoretical foundations of Edward's work and put them to use.
You know, I noticed that the Simplicity tools are labeled as lateral thinking techniques that are used in Simplicity. Can you give us an example of one of those techniques?
Geez, one of my favorite ones is it's a kind of an outlandish name, but it's a great technique, and it's a technique where we remove things. It's amputation, if you will, is what we're trying to do with this. And with the amputation technique, we're looking at different elements of something and seeing what would happen if they were flat out removed. What would happen if we were to do that? And it is based on a lateral thinking technique, and it uses that technique to great effect, and it's good stuff.
So the tool itself is provocative amputation?
Yes, that's right, provocative amputation. Strange name.
And do you have an example of where that's been applied?
Well, I think a good example of provocative amputation would be if one were to think about a stove that one would have in a kitchen. Whether it's a gas stove or an electric stove, that there have to be some burner upon which the pot or a pan is placed. And on an electric stove, as we see in the picture there, we have four elements, and when you cook something on those elements, if you're boiling something a little too rigorously and it starts to overflow from the pot or the pan, it pours down in between those elements and on those elements, and it becomes very, very difficult to clean. An example of provocative amputation would be to say, well, in order to cook something, we need some sort of a heating element. Provocative amputation would say, let's just remove the heating element. And an example of that would be a flat surface stove or cooker, such as the one that you see in the picture there. And what that does is, from the point of view of a consumer or a customer, it makes things much easier. One, you can use the surface when the burners aren't on as extra counter space, and if you are using them as a way to heat food, and if there is a spillage or overflow or what have you, this flat surface is much easier to clean. Now, it may be a little more difficult for the manufacturer of the stove to make such a stove as the one that you see there. But de Bono says you have to weigh, for whom are we making things simpler? Are we trying to make it simpler for ourselves? Are we trying to make it simpler for our customers? Or are we trying to make it simpler for both of us? And so this whole idea of value packages and for whom are we making things simpler plays a very fundamental part in the Simplicity Workshop. But I think this is a good example of provocative amputation, where we took the provocation of removing the burners almost literally, and came up with a surface as you see there.
Well, thank you for that description. That certainly is helpful. And, you know, it seems that one of the other benefits of a tool, a formal tool, is that you can get to these types of conclusions a lot faster instead of, you know, waiting 100 years or better to make cleaning a stove easier for people, because it certainly is not fun.